My name's Austin Williams. I'm the director of the Future Cities Project. And welcome to this Bookshop Barney, where we're discussing this book with the author Ben Cobley. It's his latest book, The Progress Trap, The Modern Left and the False Authority of History. Ben is a former Labour Party activist who resigned before it was fashionable. And he's now a journalist writing for magazines like Unheard long after it was fashionable. So for those who haven't yet read the book on progress, this is an open debate, so we welcome any old reactionary who wants to come and listen in and feel free to contribute. So this is also the first Battle of Ideas Festival satellite event, which if you haven't been to that, it's a wonderful weekend of debate and discussion on the 18th and 19th of October in a couple of weeks' time. Again, see the link in the chat. It's a festival that makes the Reform Conference look like the Lib Dem Conference. 400 speakers, 100 sessions, and another Bookshop Barney, as it happens, with Bijan Omrani on this book, God is an Englishman, Bijan Omrani. So come along to that. But tonight, we're going to explore this book on progress, not, as you might have expected, the much-praised book, Enemies of Progress, which is by me, which Ben accidentally forgot to include in his bibliography, but it's available in all bargain basements. Anyway, this is a really, really interesting read, thoroughly recommended, thoroughly entertaining book. It's the follow-up to his original book, The Tribe, The Liberal Left and the System of Diversity. And that book looked at the potential of the potential end of the social contract, how diversity became a system of conformity. And this book explores the political authority, how the political authority or the progressive mindset has allowed that to happen. So there's lots to talk about, lots of contemporary arguments and discussions to address. The way it's going to work is I'm going to give Ben just 5 minutes just to outline the book, and then I'll raise 4 or 5 questions, if you will, for him to have more bites of the cherry, effectively. So if you haven't read the book yet, then you have more of an idea what he's on about. And then when we've done that, we'll come out to yourselves. There is a hands raise function on Zoom. If you've forgotten how to use Zoom, then just click on that and I'll see you and I'll take you in order. It might be as well if we test the mute button, because you're all muted. If you want to unmute, then give a round of applause to Ben. Ben, it's over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Austin, and also thanks for the Academy of Ideas for supporting this, but especially Austin for organising it and promoting it in a remarkable way. Also, thanks for everyone for participating. So yeah, straight into it. I think I'm gonna introduce the book by asking myself a question, which is, are progressives to blame? You know, for example, for all that's going on at the moment, you know, problems with free speech, identity politics, cascading problems in the public sector, and elsewhere. Are progressives to blame? Or you could say, is progressivism as an ideology to blame? So I'm going to break it down into 2 parts. The first, I'm going to basically argue yes, very briefly. And then the second, I'm actually going to muddy the waters a bit. So the first part, basically, let's try and define progressivism as a sort of ideology. And for me, at its core, if you break it down to its most simple elements, it's really a way of relating to time, like a form of temporality, I say. So it doesn't see time just as a succession of moments, but as a vehicle of improvement. So basically what comes after will be better than before. And obviously in progressive ideologies, you find there are bumps in the road, and as the bad people take over and before they are ultimately defeated. But that's the basic idea. The future will be better than the present, and then what is from the past basically is subject to elimination unless it's, you know, part of the greater future that's coming up. Now in the book I give actually no, I should go back. I've jumped ahead of myself. So basically with the progressive ideology, it's a general story. It's not about certain elements progressing. It's the whole. the universe, you could say. So, I mean, I think that it obviously opens up a level of indiscipline for progressives when they're talking about what they believe in, what they want to do. It's sort of malleable, this sort of generality of what you're actually talking about. So people generally sort of reduce it to one sort of measurement. For example, GDP might be one. Nowadays, of course, diversity, ethnic diversity will be one. So you just basically measure how good things are by, the amount of ethnic diversity as a sort of shorthand for the general progress they're talking about. The other element of this is, and this is at the core of the book's argument, is that this story of general overall progress in history is a pretty big deal, and it implants a great level of authority on the person who has it, because you're basically talking about, if you know what the future is, the past, present, and future overall, sort of encompassing everything of relevance. That's like I say, it's a pretty big deal. It gives you a large amount of knowledge, not just about past and present, but the future. And I say this is the sort of knowledge that the God would have. So basically, progressivism as ideology imprints a great authority on the self. Now, one of the examples I give in the book of someone who does this type of thing is the radio talk show host James O'Brien. Now, when you hear him talk, I mean, if you look at his book titles, and I had the misfortune for the book to read one of them. It's How to Be Right, How Not to Be Wrong, and then I think the latest one is, something like How These Guys Fucked It Up. Basically sort of Tories, progressives, right wingers, populists. So you can tell in these book titles they're very didactic. They're basically sort of instruction manuals telling you how to think. And I think, I mean, obviously James O'Brien isn't to blame for everything that's going wrong at the moment, but I think his attitude is emblematic of what I call sometimes the progressive establishment. In that they present themselves as the people who know. They basically understand the whole thing that's going on. They understand what causes bad things to happen and what causes good things to happen. Good things to happen is them and their ideas, of course. So I think that's sort of summing up the positive case very briefly. The
Good.
The sort of muddy
was that your intro? That's your 5 minutes.
No, that was first part. Have I gone 5 minutes already?
Yeah, but you want to give it another minute?
Oh shit, another minute. Okay, well I'll be very, very brief. Well, as I have to be. The muddy in the water side is that, especially as I was writing the book and since, have found out and noticed how this sort of style of understanding the world is almost kind of universal, and that so many people use it. And I was going to give one example of Rupert Lowe's vehicle, Restore Britain. They tweeted it out recently, the last Labour government, as a factual thing about. And obviously Rupert Lowe is an arch anti-progressive, as in the left, identity politics, immigration. But that's a progressive thing to say, because you're basically asserting that the future will be what you want it to be. It will be aligned to your desires. So I'll leave it there because I've gone too far, but there's more obviously to add on examples.
That's all right. No, very, very good. Sorry to rush you and everything, and hopefully my signal is okay. Hopefully all our signals are all right. Look, so just again, just to round up for the audience, there's loads of really good stuff, depending on what side you're on, obviously, but you're criticizing therapy culture, identity politics, instrumentalism in the arts, European Union, hate speech. I mean, there's a whole panoply of topics in there. But just let me go back to the beginning where even your introduction started, because you say you're focusing. Well, actually, when I read it, I thought you're going to focus on progress, and then this word progressive comes up, and I don't know whether they're necessarily the same thing or obviously the same root. But then you move on to progressivism. Why progressivism is so successful, you say, and again, I mean, maybe I'm over egging it, right? Or well, maybe it's not a fair observation, but in today's context, you kind of, it's like, when you think about Islam versus Islamism, one is a belief and the other is a kind of a political ideology. You kind of think, is that what you're getting at with progressivism? Is that what you're trying to hint at? As I say, am I overstating it?
Well, it's complicated, of course, but I think a useful way of addressing it actually is if we just use the word progress as a description, something getting better, a progress.
Yeah.
There's absolutely, of course, nothing wrong with that. Um, but there's a difference between that, between especially as I say it, describing a certain thing. Say, I'm getting better at calligraphy, or something like that. You're describing something, enclosed, tangible. Well, progressivism as an ideology, and then the progressive as someone who holds that ideology or at least aligns to it, is really, as I see it, it's a whole different thing. It's a form of knowledge about, like I say, it's about the whole of history, of addressing that. So it I can't really emphasize too much how big that is.
No,
Like
that's
the chapter taking the place of God, which is the
yeah.
second chapter in the book.
Well, we'll come on to that in a second, but since you mentioned this kind of time framing, I was going to rudely say that I felt some of it was ahistorical, but that's not correct, really. I was just wondering what you thought about how things have changed over time, because in many respects in the book, you were looking at progressive politics in the 20th century. Let's say the modernist period, radical period in the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, or the revolutionary period in the Enlightenment. Is that the same when you talk about progressive? Is that the same political ideology, the same idea, um, related to a much more kind of politically passive period today? How do you differentiate the periods? Are they all the same?
Well, I would say in that introductory chapter in particular, I'm looking to tell a historical story of how progress has appeared in at different times and in different ways. So I see our own progressives at the moment, and actually as I alluded to earlier, there are all sorts of progressives. Rupert Lowe, for example, is a progressive in his own way. So it's really drawing out different forms, how it kind of adapts over time. I think as one form, for example, I mean, an obvious simple form is Soviet communism. It drifted, well, it bounced along for a few decades and then just exhausted itself. And you could say maybe neoliberal capitalist progressivism sort of replaced it, you could say, as in a certain way, maybe in Russia or in general, and kind of looking at the expanded West. So I'm not really like saying there are different sort of phases it's gone through. It's more that it kind of shapeshifts over time, I think, and kind of pops up in different ways. With one obvious distinction which I make in the book, obviously, is between open and closed progressivism.
Mm-hmm.
So open progressivism is the liberal form, which believes in free speech. Actually, if we just let things hang out and we let people speak freely and organize freely and do what they want, then things will improve naturally through that process. And then you have the closed form of progressivism, which I think is dominant or has been dominant in our institutions, at the moment, and also pops up in communism with a capital C, which is, I say, kind of looking to grip reality by the neck almost and control it and sort of push it in its own directions, which are aligned to its own interests.
Okay, well, I mean, obviously, part of the problem with the open and closed definition is that it covers all bases, then, doesn't it? It's just that you've got. Let me give you another quote. Forget Soviet. communism. I'm going to give you a quote from your book. You say Hitler's thinking has strong parallels with progressive politics. Because, and you could say because the racial destruction of the Jews sounds similar to pro-Palestinian activists today. I'm sure there'll be people on both sides arguing whether that's true or not. But the comparisons are there to be made. But for me, that shows up why these arguments today or then are not progressive. You'd be hard pushed to say that Nazi Germany was progressive. I would say, wouldn't you?
Well, obviously, it's not progressive as in we want it or we like it. We think that represents a form of progress.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm saying in the book in those passages is that Nazism, Hitler's ideology was sort of immersed in progressive assumptions. And I think, there's an obvious distinction there in that it's not universal. He's not looking to save the whole world and to improve the whole universe. That's one element in which he's limiting it down to
Okay.
the Aryan race and to the nation of Germany. But he has that story of destiny. I mean, the Thousand-Year Reich.
Mm-hmm.
It's a story of destiny, and him and his people was the vehicle to achieve it. Like a vanguard. And of course, Hitler was, for a while a communist, and Goebbels was, quite strongly as well. So their thinking as it evolved was, quite strongly influenced by left progressivism.
Okay. I'll leave that open for wider discussion. I hate playing the Hitler bingo thing. Do you know what I mean? The first person to mention it, but I thought I'd better bring it up. But when you move on and you talk about, again, I'll give you a quotation. You say, progress is the moral authority that justifies and facilitates imperialism and colonialism. Progress is inherently illiberal. Actually, when I got to think about it, I've always been interested in this concept of progress and how it's been seen over time. And when I think about the destruction of Native American Indians, clearing the way for American development, it's a historic event that was brutal, but it's over there. It's in the dim distant past. It happened 200 years ago, and in some ways we appreciate the benefits that it brought. But when you see what's happening in China now, removing farmers and villages, building cities, and all the rest of it, then the brutality is kind of very immediate. So I just wonder, is China within their rights to say they're only following the same path to progress, but it's a bit later than what happened in the West? Well, how do you see it? How do you map those two senses together? Different, same kind of brutality, but over time we see it differently.
Well, I think as you might have got from the book, I'm not a progressive myself.
No.
So and it's the book is more of a skeptical, critical. I wouldn't claim to tell the Chinese how to run their country, but obviously, like you say, there are elements which are pretty troubling for a lot of people, and in that sense, it does have parallels with European colonialism and various other sort of French Revolution, Russian Revolution. The rest. So I don't really quite know how to respond there. But
Well,
just to go on.
Well, just respond in the way that you feel fit. I mean, I wasn't accusing you of being a progressive. I was just kind of saying that there's a element of progressive politics which has, given the distance of history, we are much more acclimatized to some of those things in the past, and in some ways, many progressives now look back on them with a bit of trepidation.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. That there are always trade-offs. I think that's a good way of addressing it. Is that, for example, with you could say with European colonialism, there were positive elements of it. Getting rid of cannibalism, sati in India, slavery, you could say, of course, eventually. So that there were always trade-offs there, positives and negatives. And I think the progressive mindset is always to sort of ignore or set aside or just downgrade and not talk about the negative sides. and I think that's a correct characteristic of progressive ideology as a whole. And if we just recognize those things and say, well, on the balance, maybe we think those things were worthwhile. I mean, I haven't got much problem with that.
And that worthwhileness is how do you make that distinction? That some things are worthwhile and some things aren't.
Yeah, I think that they're judgment calls, really, and
Good.
I don't pretend to be the ultimate arbiter. In fact, that's what I'm trying to get away from in the book.
Well, you say that. I kind of think that you make there are some very clear, pointed comments that you make in the book. I mean, I understand where you're coming from reading the book. So don't hold back, don't be shy. But let me ask you another one. One is on what you talked about in your intro about this kind of not belief in the future or a kind of the way progressives assert their moral rightness projected into the future, that kind of thing. Um, the thing about that is that ironically, and again, this might come down to where we have maybe a disagreement about what we mean by progressive or how static that is. But ironically, I see most so-called progressives fearful of the future and on environmentalism, which you don't touch really in the book, which I thought was quite strange. Um, I think that's kind of colored the way that we see progress. Nowadays, the future is seen as actually a dangerous place to be or a dodgy place to be. Or no, we were filled with trepidation thinking about the future. So there you are talking about the future as if it's the progressive mindset. And I'm thinking for progressives, actually people look to the future with a certain amount of doubt, cynicism, and fear. So again, how might that factor into your thesis?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point, and I would say it's useful not to think of people, of everyone, as absolute progressives. 100% you are a progressive, therefore every single part of you is like that. In practice, I think we all switch from you could say basically from optimism to pessimism. So, like you say, a lot of people who in other types of ways are sort of guardians of the future, bringing the brave new world in through identity politics, for example, and immigration and all the rest of it. Or you could say, sort of improvements in the economy as well. And then you have, like you say, this pessimism and fear of the future, and it's like simply they're not being consistent in progressivism there. But I don't necessarily blame them for that. It's perfectly natural to see things which you like happening and which you don't.
Okay. So why did you leave out the environment? You mentioned nature in a couple of pages, but you left out that whole thread, which for me almost exemplifies the progressive mindset. Again, I'm going to air quote progressives every time I say it, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I like I say, I didn't consider that an aspect of the the progressivism of our current day progressives. It's an inconsistent aspect, and I mean it's one thing I could have written about, but there are so many things to write about, and I already missed out quite a lot. So some things you just have to leave aside, and that's one thing. But
Fair
I'd be
enough.
quite interested in what you say its core. I'd quite like to hear more about that.
Okay, that's over a pint maybe. You're misunderstanding the nature of the Barney, and I asked the
Wow.
questions, as Hitler would say. But right, look, in part, you see again. I'm going to quote: "Progress is a promotional tool." Again, this is another section. So I agree with you. By the way, as I said at the beginning, you touch on a million topics, right? So there's a lot to kind of talk about. But you say, in large part, progress is a promotional tool. Page 70, if you're looking. And progressivism as the authority making us do things, justifying certain buying habits and political choices. So, again, this is all part of that general mood of capitalism interchangeable with progress in some respects. Um, but actually, I thought it was a critique of modernity and consumerism. You were quite strong on that, I thought, which ironically is where contemporary progressives are coming from. So, there you are saying you're not a progressive. But ironically, I felt you were buying into a lot of that progressive mantle. So I was just wondering whether you thought that this book was a hopeful book or a despondent book, or how do you pitch this?
Yeah, I think there's an element of hope in there, and I wouldn't write it if there isn't. But it's more a critical hope. It's it's hoping that we know that we engage our brains, that we think about these things rather than recite these slogans, which are to hand. They're promotional tools. You're on the right side of history. Historians will say that I'm right. These type of things. They're to hand, and they make life in some ways easier and more comfortable. They make us more confident. But in terms of my hope is really that, I mean, if you look at our present day politics, it's just so dead. It's just so dull, and it is, I would say, almost 100% progressive in the way it sort of addresses all sorts of different questions. And my interest is to get people or to do things like this, to actually to talk and listen and think. And I think progressive ideologies is a classic thing that is not thought about hardly at all. I'd like us to start questioning these people. What the hell do you mean by that? On the right side of history, you know,
Well, look,
sort of historians will say, well, what, how many historians in the future? All of them? Or is there just one history that will happen in the future? Sort of once thought
well,
narrows down to one opinion.
well, that's fair. That's fair, dude. But I think, ironically, the end of your book, the very last sentence of your book, I've only got a couple of questions, by the way, left. But um, you say, would discarding the assumption of progress open the way for actual progress? And I was wondering whether that's a fatalistic assumption, let it all hang out kind of thing, or are you, as you just said, directing it by conversation, by discussion, by debate, and having an open, political intervention. So, would discarding the assumption of progress open the way for actual progress? Is where you leave us hanging. What would you mean by that?
I mean, going back to the definitions, definition of progress versus progressive ideology.
Yeah,
So I'm talking about progress as in measurable, sort of discrete things getting better. Say, for example, the train's starting to, they're starting to work properly.
getting the trains
The
run on time.
police arresting people, for committing crime rather than for saying things which the establishment doesn't like. Basically measurable, obvious, tangible things to make life better, rather than sort of indulging in this sort of farrago of authority, word soups. People who are not thinking when they're talking, and yet they're running the government. I think
Okay,
that basically sums it up.
all right. Okay, very political now. Okay, just a couple more questions. You've
Just
got a
two
couple
more.
of. I've got loads more, but I'm just ask you a few more. You got one. Well, you got two chapters really. One's on like Christianity. One's on, you mentioned Jesus. So there's a lot of chapter headings on religion, if I may be so bold as to assert that. And I've noticed that there's a kind of a growing popular idea like this amongst post-liberals, that Christianity gives us some sense of community or gives us some sense of purpose. And I'm wondering whether that's what you're driving at, or whether it's accidental, or whether you're using it as a device. What do you think about it?
No, I don't. I don't think I say that at all. Um, I, th- I think that Christianity obviously does give people a purpose, and I think this is one of the points progressivism does too. And in that sense, it sort of fulfills a similar role to religion. That it's obviously, or in its different forms, it's not actually a religion itself, but it picks up on the religious style, especially the Christian style.
Oh, that's it. End.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I got
All
nothing
right.
more to
Okay.
say.
That
Yeah.
was no, because you say as a relatively new and
Read the
rising
book.
force, as a relatively new and rising force in the West, Islam can appear quite readily as a form of progress, or at least as part of the march of history. The progressive animus against religion is by no means absolute. So that's where that idea came from. I was focusing more on the Christianity side with the God, because you talk about the history will decide, and then you say replace the word history with God, and it
Mm.
takes on a whole new kind of belief, faith-based
And
system.
just to interrupt you, I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
that sentence you read out, I think it's the only part of the book when I talk about Islam and what you might call Islamo-progressivism. It's one of those aspects which would be really interesting to cover because it's a major, Islamism basically is you might say it's progressive Islam in terms of adopting forms of politics, but also that sort of future-based temporality of, things get better will be us winning, will be Islam winning. That's the way they, a lot of these Islamist activists, they see it.
right. Give us your perspective.
That is my perspective.
Well, you're just observing. I'm just
Yeah,
saying, do you have?
yeah,
I know
yeah.
you
That,
can't
that's
be you can't
that's
you
what I
can't be
do.
utterly passive, Ben. You
Yeah,
have a
man.
you
I
have a
mean,
position.
obviously, I don't think it is because I'm not a Muslim and I don't want to live under Islamic law. But I mean,
Right.
I think that's obvious. I mean,
Oh,
it's
okay,
it's
okay.
not particularly interesting.
No, it's just obviously I think that in the real world, outside this kind of conversation, there are a lot of people who are searching for something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And that might end up being Islam or Islamism, as you just put it, in a slightly positive sense, or it might be Catholicism. We'll find out. Anyway, final question. You say I'm going to give you another quotation. And by the way, yes, I'm obviously taking bloody quotes out of your book, maybe arbitrarily, but I'm just here to kind of rub your nose in it a little bit. You say,
I'm just worried because I've forgotten it.
yeah, I'm reminding you of it.
It's
People
80,000 words gone.
People appear as human resources whose role is to support power rather than to question and participate in it. Yes, under this system, you say, under this system, people appear as human resources whose role is to support power rather than to question and participate in it. Anyway, the question there is, and it's a much more direct reference to the real world, I suppose, is given, as you've pointed out, that we're living in a very dour boring political arena normally. In the last couple of months, what we've seen, you've mentioned reform. No, you mentioned um, you've mentioned kind of political parties that people are beginning to challenge the status quo in some respects, whether you like it or not. Yes. So I just wonder whether you think that sentence still holds true. People appear as human resources whose role is to support power rather than question or participate in it. I'm seeing an awful lot of questioning and participation. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree.
Go, Ben. Have you have been taking
No,
tablets? Right,
maybe
go.
maybe say a bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that. That we've got more of a lively political scene at the moment. Um, Although, I mean, I was going to say earlier, in relation to what Rupert Lowe, that statement. I mean, you find it with reform with Nigel Farage. Basically, I think he largely copies the Donald Trump sort of playbook, which is very brash and stating that they will win. Again, Labour will definitely be defeated. We'll be the next government, and it really builds confidence, and I think has a role there. I'm a bit ambivalent about this, but also this progressive style, this anticipation that things will improve, that things will get better, that you will win. I think it also, well, I know it encourages complacency and encourages you not to think about the actual dynamics of power. And it's like, okay, Labour may have collapsed in the polls, but virtually every institution in Britain is still dominated by left progressives. And that counts for a lot. And once elections start coming along, they start grinding their gears and getting their game going. It's by no means a foregone conclusion we're going to have a change in government after the next election. And I think this sort of progressive sort of style of hype, although it does raise your confidence and maybe bring people together, it also makes you a bit lazy. And I think they need to start thinking seriously about how they're gonna do things in government if they get anywhere near it. They need to be convincing.
That's a policy conversation. Is that what you mean? Or are you saying they should start to reflect on what the social progress ought to mean?
Well, I don't want to sort of talk like I'm a on-hand political advisor to
Well,
reform because it's
you
something
started it.
I haven't thought about that much. But talking in the more general sense, this, like I say, this progressive style of assuming you're going to win isn't all good. And I'll maybe just go back again to recap over that progressive style because I think it's reasonably original. What I've come up with. Which is it's a relation to time. It's that time as a vehicle of improvement, and as a vehicle of improvement, it will improve your own tangible prospects, but it also gives you the authority, the knowledge of history, which imprints sort of great, like I say, authority on the self. And this encourages all sorts of hubris. And I think you see it all the time. I mentioned James O'Brien, but many others too. Um, they're very confident public speakers, but they're talking actually a lot of bollocks a lot of the time. But it sort of flies along a sort of a vague consensus. And in the book and more generally, I think I try and look to challenge that.
On that note, on that bombshell, thank you very much indeed, Ben. Very good.
Thanks,
Look,
Austin.
I'm
Good
gonna I'm gonna
questions.
I'm gonna open it up to the floor. I'm gonna take two questions. We've got four hands at the moment, so I'll take two people if you scribble these down. So we got Wendy and then Para.
Oh, hi, Ben. I've read most of your book and I found it really interesting. And I think what you're saying is very thought-provoking. But I suppose the kind of sort of surfacing from reading what you've read, I'm kind of left with a sense of, well, I sympathize with a lot of what you say about activists telling us what it means to be progressive, telling us who's on the right and who's on the wrong side of history, and that kind of arrogance and hubris, as you call it, and the kind of complete lack of humility you get in some of the way that activists operate these days. But I do wonder about the question of having a vision and having a sense of what the future might carry for us. And, what would enable us to really start thinking more actively as individuals, so we're not just feeling passive, what gives people a sense of agency. And I think the way you're talking, the thing that worries me more than anything else is that sense that almost like you're condemning agency. And I'm sure you're not, but I think the problem with using the word progressive, I mean, obviously progress is something that's up for debate. Well, what is progress? That's something what would make the world a better place? How do we make the world a better place? Who makes the world? All of those questions are really important questions. So discussing it in terms of just a broad condemnation of progressivism, I think there's obviously a difference you need to make between progressivism and progress, but I feel that doesn't necessarily that question possibly gets suppressed in what you're saying.
Very good. Thank you very much, Wendy. I will take Para, and then I'll come back to you, Ben.
Hi, Ben. I found the book very interesting. Lots of recommendations I'd agree with. But what I wanted your opinion on is that I see the new progressivism, i.e., what's happening today, having actually lost the link, if you like, with the idea of progress. So for me, the way I understood was the old progressivism, or some people will call it classical progressivism, had a positive view of change, was optimistic, believed in innovation, experimentation, and it was linked to progress, had a vision of utopia, if you like, and aligned with that civilizational values, duty, patriotism, courage, family, solidarity. And it also, the old believed in passing on legacy and historical achievements to future generations. Now, I find that progressivism does not exist anymore. And the new one doesn't really believe in all this, and rather, as I think you allude to, promotes identity politics, diversity, celebrates different, not solidarity, and actually argues that Western civilization should be shamed. And, never mind the understanding that humans make mistakes, learn from the past, and move on. And certainly, this new thinking does not believe in any human achievements in the past should be passed on, celebrated. So I do see a distinction between the old and the new. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on this.
Very good. Thank you very much. Ben, do you want to come back on those points?
Yeah, no, really, really interesting points, both of them. Firstly, Wendy, yeah, the idea I'm condemning agency, I confess I don't get that. I thought I was doing the opposite. So maybe I didn't do that good a job. But I think really the book it's a critique of progress, you might say, as a form of knowledge. So as a form of fact that we know it. We know the sweep of history from the past to the present, but also into the future. And I'm saying this is fake. It's false. It's really, you can't really. I mean, to an extent in the book, I do leave aside the question of whether we are actually progressing. So I think it's unanswerable in a sense, and I'd rather focus on specific things which, politically we can address to make things better. Para, yeah, really nice way of putting that. I think especially passing on achievements, that idea that great things have been achieved in the past and we need to keep hold of them and preserve them. You might say it's a tension between conservatism or progressivism, but I think it's just, if maybe we go back to the idea, the actual idea of tangible progress, that's where it is. Let's see if there was anything else I've missed. Yes, I think that distinction between the old and the new, I think to an extent has always been around. And I think it's roughly that distinction between the open and the closed. The open form of progress, which is more critical, more interested, open to ideas and to free speech and all the rest of it. And I think there's a lot that's good in that sort of form, although I think it can, as I argue in the final chapter, I think it's in recent times, in recent decades, through our progressive liberals, it's sort of lost its spirit and its thought of actually what it's trying to do, and got very complacent and smug and not really thinking about what it's doing, and therefore has just ended up, as is its wont, just kind of giving way to whatever is powerful at the moment, because if it's powerful at the moment, it must be progress, it must be something that's taking us into the future in a good way. And I just think, yeah, they've stopped thinking, and maybe that's the source of the old and the new form not being so positive that Para was talking about.
Okay, I've got plenty to come back on that, but we'll take Alka.
Okay, hi. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Austin. Right. So first of all, Ben, the copy I read was the pre-proof one, so I hope it hasn't changed too much in between that. So just wanted to say that. I actually really, I found your book puzzling, a bit irritating at times, but overall really thought-provoking. So in that sense, I think it's great. And you don't need to say whether you're for or against agency. If you're getting people thinking, then you're obviously doing a good job on that front. So I did think it was really it got me thinking in a lot of ways, and I just want to try explore some of them here now, if that's okay. Para, I'd really like to sort of build on what you said, but I would just like to shift it a little bit in that it you talked about not a kind of idea of the future or a vision of the future or with progress or this or that, but what's missing from all of this is people, us ourselves. When the key thing is, how do we see ourselves, not then or now, not then or in the future, but actually now? What is our judgment, our assessment of what kind of species we are, what we're capable of, really kind of quite fundamental existential questions. You see, from your book, my reading of it was that it isn't, when you're talking about progressivism, it's not about the future at all, right? It's actually it's an ideological form of legitimizing, parasitic on knowledge, particularly history and sociology and science, which I think you detailed very well in your book. And the thing with that is that, like you take science or you take history, it allows you to see patterns in certain ideas and events, etc. And so you get this idea of predictability. And it's like, if you have possession of that, then you can predict the future. And that's, I think, where the slippage with authority comes. But of course, no knowledge, not even physics or nuclear knowledge, can actually explain causes, right? They can give you patterns and tell you, sort of suggest lines of development, but they can't actually give you causes. So I think what your book is very interestingly raising is the use of knowledge, or not really in a legitimate way if you're talking about traditional academic or disciplinary standards, but the political use of knowledge, the authority of knowledge extended to well beyond its remits to justify a political order or a hegemonic order that is all about stasis, that is all about not going anywhere in the future, that is about not even being negative about agency, but just like, outsourcing our agency totally to either technocratic or very fun, kind of fundamentalist things. And I was thinking about the rise of identity politics and the rise of Islamism in the Middle Eastern world. And somebody might correct me on my history here, but I think they both kind of broadly, I'm sure there will be local and domestic specifics, but broadly became stronger in a period when you had the demise of really transcendental ideologies of capitalism and communism. And those kinds of those overarching paradigms, which were more than just political and more than just about technical progress, they were about how you see the world, people, etc., as well as the future. With the demise of those, we've seen sort of the kind of in the West, the kind of rise of identity politics that is totally, as I said, about stasis. And in the Middle East, the rise of Islamism that pretends to be a universalism with jihadism, but of course has its problems with that, even if you take it as a true universalism. Sorry, that was a bit rambly, but I just wondered, basically what I'm saying is I don't think it's about the future at all, and it doesn't really matter. Wouldn't get hung up about that. Are we progressing? Are we not progressing? Sure, we are. Some countries are progressing more than others technologically, economically, but I think what we're talking about when we're talking about the kind of progress Para mentioned, it was more than just about money and more than just about technology. It was about, really taking the world forward in some way.
That's very good. That was horrendous a lecture. Thank you very much. No. Very, very useful. Dennis.
I was going to say progress for me would be a good internet connection in Derbyshire, which I don't have. I've disappeared from half of this. But when you were talking, I kept thinking, there's a counterexample to what you're saying, because most of the talk about being progressive today comes in education. And I sat next to a head teacher a few weeks ago who told me in a patronizing way, "You don't understand what education is about. It's all about the child." And in education, of course, people have given up on any idea that they have authority, what I put as epistemological authority. They think everything is to do with the child. It's centered on the child, and not the child's need, but a sort of form of therapy. So progressivism, in its most common manifestation, which, children meet it, teachers meet it, everybody involved in education meets it, is not about asserting your knowledge. It's denying that you've anything to pass on, and that you have to give kids something else that isn't actual knowledge. It's a sort of therapeutic thing. So you sort of keep them happy and keep them content, but doing things and giving them sort of therapy that keeps replicating itself. So there's not a vision of the future. It's just therapy and more therapy. And that seemed to contradict to your point about people saying we have this and that knowledge and we will assert it. That's true in a lot of the areas you were saying, but education is a major area of life. And it seems to me something opposite to what you're saying is happening there.
All right, good. The gauntlet has been thrown down after a very supportive piece from Arca. Ben, do you want to come back on these?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point Dennis made, and I try and contest it by saying, actually, this sort of progressive education, the child-centered education, it's based on apparent knowledge of the child, and seeing. I mean, what in the book actually, I speak about how progressives, forgive me, have effectively overturned the idea of maturity, so that rather than you get more mature as you get older, they think about it really in historical terms, as in the child, in a sense, is more mature than an older person because they're coming later in history. So in the sense I used actually in my first book, you need to outsource authority to them. So yeah, I think there's maybe a sort of a bit of a paradox there, in that the teachers, the educationalists are claiming that the teacher shouldn't have authority, but that's a form of authority to say that they shouldn't have authority. I hope that makes sense. What Alka said, she referred to, how in the book I speak about social science and history, and how this is key, and I would say just to add to what she said, that it's largely about causation. It's manifestly so often self-serving, and sort of ignores memory holes, that which isn't convenient. So basically, in terms of causation, it's back to the James O'Brien. It's and actually I speak of him in the chapter, The Uses of Social Science, although he's obviously not a social scientist. He knows who causes bad things to happen, and his books and his social media witterings and his talk show are composed of basically repeating endlessly that these populists, these right-wingers, these Brexiteers, these conservatives cause bad things to happen in society. And he has, academic think tank evidence to hand. And alongside that is, of course, I go back to the title of his books, How Not to Be Wrong. It's like he is the locus of authority of everything that is really right. It's kind of it's ridiculous and funny, but also like a bit scary how someone I think can be that didactic, and how they can be widely. I think he's probably the most successful talk show host we have. So it obviously works for a lot of people.
Okay, maybe we have to say over and out when you finish. Right, we've got Claire, and then Hilary, and Irene. Claire first.
Hello. So I feel a little guilty that I haven't read the book, but I've come to this because it's about persuading us to buy the book and read it. So, so far, so interesting. But I have to now declare, I feel like that first of all, I believe in progress. And secondly, until recently, I would have called myself progressive. I know it's become a dirty word, but because I believe in progress, I would have considered myself, in fact, I've called myself progressive until only relatively recently, when it's become associated with the identitarian progressives as discussed. So that's just to get that out of the way. Because I haven't read the book, I'm just quoting what you've said, Ben, just to get a bit of clarity. I mean, when we end up in a situation where Rupert Lowe and Hitler could be described as progressives by you, I do think the world's gone mad. But possibly I just don't agree with your thesis. Rupert Lowe's reactionary. He's never had a progressive bone in his body. And Hitler, I don't want to even go there. But one of the things that you said was that the reason why, for example, Hitler might have been progressive in your mind was because he linked everything with destiny as though it was all inevitable. But I wanted to challenge that notion, because actually the concept of progress, as I've always understood it and why I've always believed in it, was precisely that it was about transcending destiny. It was about actually the recognition that you didn't have a clear path that was given to you by someone else, but that the subject, the emergence of the individual, could overcome that idea of destiny completely. And so if you want, and now I've got to do something very peculiar, which is I now want to vaguely defend, I hope this is off the record, vaguely defend James O'Brien. Or let's put it this way. My problem with James O'Brien is not that he's arrogant or that he believes in himself, because actually I think there's something important about defending self-governance and a sense of surety in your ideas and so on and so forth. So he might be obnoxious in all sorts of ways, but there's nothing wrong with that, is there? Because the point about the transcending destiny and what I suppose was progressive about progressive as I'd always understood it, was that it was a belief that through self-governance, through the emergence of the self, of the individual as an important actor, that actually you could defy what was destined and write the future. It's not given where the future will end, but you could change, determine, have another go at, make the future different to the one that everyone assumed was there for you. And that's the whole basis on which, for me, being of a radical disposition, I see individuals as potential history makers, and that's where I cling on. I mean, I kind of resent that this notion of progressive being a bad thing, because I actually want to reclaim that word. I know it's probably gone forever, but I want to reclaim it because I really do think that there is something positive about the possibility of changing the outcome of what people assume the future will be. It's all up for grabs, in other words. So things will only get better in terms of a fight. It's not given. It's not necessarily a positive thing. But nonetheless, the notion that humans can improve their lot and improve society's lot is something which I totally believe in still. So if that puts me on the same side as, and I'm arrogant, and therefore if that puts me on the same side as James O'Brien, so be it. But they're my reservations, which I will obviously address when I'm reading the book, when I start to read the book, and see if I've got it all wrong. But that's just based on the conversation so far.
Thank you very much.
I have to keep turning my film off because it keeps going.
Thanks. We've very, very interesting backdrop. We're going to lose it now. Thank you very much, Claire. Hilary.
To ask a question about is this whole kind of project of progressivism not really actually quite dangerous in terms of what the progressives would see as what they want? Because it actually plays so many people offside. So you gave one example, for example, of how lots of the elites make British culture and British history really problematic. So I think you gave an example of a BBC Horrible Histories that effectively, paints all of British history as really problematic. And you said that what that does is it gives people a rationale to kind of renounce their country. But if it does that, what that does is it makes those people kind of very alienated and isolated, kind of outsiders. And if we all become that, that's surely a really destabilizing influence on society, and one that actually could be quite, problematic in terms of what progressives would want to see. So is this not a really dangerous project on their part, is my question.
Very good. Okay, thanks. Ben, take you, and then I'll come back out to the audience.
Firstly, with Hillary, I mean, yes, basically, I think treating large parts of the population as being essentially backward, like the natives, you have that sort of language, the nativists, is putting them outside of acceptable society and is very dangerous and very worrying. And progressives, I think, have brought it upon themselves, quite obviously, with this historical story of improvement via immigration and increasing ethnic diversity, which I'm not, obviously completely against as sort of ideas myself, but that's basically the sort of the shorthand that they use, and I think it's incredibly simplistic, ridiculous, and beyond patronizing and very dangerous, and all the rest of it. To address Claire's points, which were really interesting too, I think, I know Claire is invoking a specific form of progressive ideology, which I would maybe even say to an extent isn't maybe an ideology in the way that I'm talking about it, because I'm talking about it as a form of knowledge, really, that we know best, and therefore we can dictate to you everything that you should do and what you can say, and even arrest you if you say the wrong things. And obviously that's polar opposite to what Claire is saying. So I'm getting the sense, I mean, I don't know exactly the progressive influences maybe she's had, but I'd suggest that they're pretty different to James O'Brien's. Briefly on Rupert Lowe and Hitler as never in a million years being progressive. I mean, it just goes back to my explanation of what being a progressive is. And it's this account, going back to it yet again, of past, present, and future, understanding it, and especially understanding the future as an improvement on the past, and that you will have a major role in as an agent of progress and bringing this about. So if you think about Rupert Lowe, he's obviously, seeing that the Labour will be defeated and some form of better government, better society will be inaugurated, and sweetness and light. And Hitler, I almost regret putting him in, but I think he is a very interesting example of what I call the progressive style, and that he does have elements of it in what we might call his thinking and his assertions. And I mean, I agree with what Claire says about, for example, James O'Brien, that having confidence and expressing yourself is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, absolutely. And I'm slightly ambivalent about my critique of it, in that we all need a bit of a boost sometimes, and saying, oh, we're going to win, we're going to do it, can actually help. I mean, definitely. But yeah, with I don't know where I'm going. Over and out.
Okay, Hitler is always a conversation stopper, isn't it? Let's stop with Hitler now. Right, Irena, and then Phil. Let's call you Irena then. Is it Irene?
Yeah, Irene's fine, Austin. I'll just go straight to my question. I'm trying to be as succinct as possible. Do you think, Ben, that the decline of religion, specifically Christianity in the West, has caused this wave of progressivism, which is really like all over the place, confused. They don't know what they agree with and what they don't agree with, what they want and what they do want. So that's the first half to the question. And the second half is more of a comment because I feel like yours and Austin's likening of progressivism to almost religion or religious or like a cult. For me, it feels very much like a cult. You can't question it. You can't give your own opinion about it. So it's like you have to believe in the way what exactly they want you to believe. Do you think though the decline of Christianity has caused this because people don't the majority don't have a foundation to hold onto, that they're now wanting almost to accept anything that comes in, whether they agree with it or not?
Very good, very good. Cut to the chase, very good. And Phil.
Thanks, Austin, and thanks, Ben. I've read the book, Ben, and I find your early comments today, your 5-minute intro, very helpful in addressing and making clearer why I'm so frustrated with the book. Because I approached the book guided by its subtitle of The Modern Left as a critique of modern left progressivism. But in your opening comments today, you made the point that since you've written the book, you now see progressivism everywhere. It's ubiquitous. And so, as Claire said, it stretches from, Rupert Lowe to, to Hitler in your thesis, and, everybody else, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, Reform, Islamists, as well as what I thought was the subject matter of your book, the identitarians, the social justice warriors, and so on. And, I do think Claire's points you should take on board, in that when something, a philosophy or a form of knowledge that you present as so ubiquitous, and that you see it everywhere, then it becomes not a target that you can deal with. It's just there, out there, and every grouping and individual is just pandering to it. You were expressed some skepticism or some doubt whenever Austin said, why haven't you addressed environmentalism, as if this was a left field point. I think Austin was identifying a key kernel of modern left progressivism, which is that it's the very opposite of progress. And that's why I find the whole thing so frustrating. By conflating progressivism as a general philosophy with the idea of progress, you were blurring or obscuring, I don't know whether to yourself or to others, that modern day progressivism is defined by being anti-growth, anti-progress, anti-development. It's not just a coincidence that any social justice warrior I've ever spoken to is for net zero policies, because that's quite consistent with them seeing the development and change and innovation as dangerous. And by conflating progressivism with the spirit and idea of progress, you're completely missing why modern progressivism is a problem. So what I'd end with is saying that you quite correctly earlier in one of your responses made the point that even if Labour Party loses the elections, the progressives still control the cultural institutions. I agree with that point, but it's not progressivism in general that controls the institutions. It's a very specific modern day progressivism. And if you blur that, then you're blurring the ability to be able to challenge the identitarians and the multiculturalists and all those people that you quite correctly critique. They're the ones who are in control of the cultural institutions, the media, the arts, the academy, and so on. And if you dilute that, then you blur you undermine the potential force of your book to be a contribution to that critique of that particular anti-progress reactionary movement.
Okay, that was a good cop, bad cop questions there, Ben. You want to come back on these?
Yeah, no, interesting stuff again. Firstly, on Phil's points, I think in the book, what I was trying to do was to give an honest appraisal of what progressivism is, how it works. So I wasn't trying to delineate, here's progressivism, it's bad. It was like, well, what is it? What does it look like? And what are the different aspects of it? And I agree with Phil that maybe the subtitle of the book is slightly misleading. And it's one of those things in the lead up. I mean, we only came up with the actual title quite late after running with various other ones. And then the subtitle, actually, I mean, I never liked it, and I never thought it represented my book, but the publisher insisted on it, so I went with it. I mean, basically my first book was about the liberal left, and I wanted to do something a bit more ideas based this time.
You called it "Why Hitler is Progressive." I would have gone down.
I did actually pitch an article with exactly that title
Yeah.
to Unheard once, and they said interested, but maybe not. But yeah, no. To go back to what he said, I mean, I think, like I say, I was trying to be honest with what it is. So I can't sort of delineate to make it convenient, so we can sort of use this book as an attack, sort of dog on certain people. I wanted to be as balanced and as honest as I could, and I hope it does that okay. To Irene's question about the decline of religion as being a cause for the upsurge of progressivism and how it's so confused. Yeah, very interesting question. I wouldn't use the word cause, but I'd say it's obviously there are elements in modern progressivism which are very. I mean, Tom Holland is great on this, on how the style is so similar, and how so a lot of, say, for example, Quakers would recognize a lot of the the social movements of taking the knee and sort of knocking statues over and that sort of thing at the moment. So it's certainly, the decline of Christianity is certainly left a hole, for a lot of people, and we're used to that style, and for example, the figure of Jesus. So now we have just a general sort of embrace of victimhood and picking different characters. For example, I mean, George Floyd is the one I pick up in the book as a very obvious one, as a sort of Jesus-like sort of character who will redeem us. So I think, I mean, G.K. Chesterton, gave a great quote that I think the Christian virtues are sort of running amok or something at the moment. And in a way, you could say Christian values, the Christian style is with us, but actually the Christian institutions are not there. And in a sense, for progressives, it's a lot easier. You don't have to go to church on Sunday. You don't have to sort of read the Bible or called by, the seven deadly, go against the seven deadly sins and go with the virtues. It's in a way a lot more convenient. But it's still, like I say, in that sort of style.
Very good. Thank you very much. So these are the last two hands. Thank you very much. Nico and then Teresa. Nico, please.
Yeah, hi, Ben. I wanted to pick up on just two ideas in the book, more just to get your feedback on them. A lot of the themes of your book remind me of the idea of the Whig view or Whig interpretation of history that you described partly in your introduction, that we're on a kind of continuous kind of social progress. It's a very Victorian idea, that although I understand it was only characterized by Herbert Butterfield in the 1930s. And you talk about this movement being enshrined in the idea of Protestantism and Parliament, and also its kind of legacy primarily being expressed through the free market. And I'm very interested in this idea. I had a debate with David Willits, once science minister, about it. I tend to subscribe to it, but not perhaps in the way that conservatives used to. And part of my critique is this idea, which is very common today and ties into your idea about technocracy, that technology has agency and humans don't. And the idea of agency obviously has come up in this discussion a few times. And I wondered what your interpretation of the idea of technological agency. I mean, you talk in the book about corporations continuing to sell us very different visions of the world redeemed by their products and technology. How do you see our progressivists using the idea of technological agency in order to maintain status, if you like, or to overcome agency? Because clearly the idea of technological progress was, at least in the West and the Soviet Union, a very post-war idea, and in Southeast Asia, that whatever the limits on human freedom, we will bring you improved societies and so on. Is that a continuing idea, or is there a different way in which the idea of technology and agency and progress or progressivism is being used in the way that you characterize it today?
Thank you very much, Nico. Teresa.
I haven't read the book. I've been finding the discussion very stimulating. Perhaps I've misunderstood completely, but I'm wondering if this isn't quite a valuable way of thinking about things, that I'm understanding your sense of progressivism as a sort of template for an ideology, any ideology that has particular characteristics to do with factoring in the past and present in the way it's sort of navigating towards the future. And surprisingly, I find your example about Nazism quite interesting. At the time, it was widely adhered to. Now we'd see it as delusional. I think a lot of us would, clearly not everyone. And a lot of people thought, who adhered to the ideology, that they were engaging in something that was distasteful, but for the good of humanity. And that's something we're seeing now again. I mean, some of the marches that have been around recently, such as the march over Sydney Harbour Bridge, called itself a march for humanity. So I think one of the problems, that I see now is the dominance of feeling over critical thinking and information, so that it often seems as though people don't know how to think critically, so emote, and the less you know about the subject, very often more angrily people seem to emote. But it's, we live in a time where a lot of people seem to think that their dominant value is to live their best life. And but that is quite inconsistent, because some of the people who think that also seem to want to overturn, civilization, overturn the West. And that seems to me to contrast with something like the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, which has been sort of handing on its ideology from generation to generation with a particular sort of future in mind. And just as an example of how different, so, if I'm understanding correctly, we need to distinguish between what we call progressive now and a progressivism, which in a sense could be instantiated in countless ways as long as it had particular characteristics. And so now we live in a time where we seem unable to agree on anything, even the meanings of words, so that silence now seems to be almost synonymous at times with violence. So, what you're saying, I was finding useful as for thinking about things, but in practice, I don't know where it takes us. And
Okay.
can I just say one thing? I saw a sign today in a video where some people who were clearly Islamists were carrying a sign saying, Islamism is the future, democracy is a cancer.
Good. We won't use that as the strap line for this video when we put it out. Thank you very much. And I got one last question from Alex Standish, please.
Thank you, Austin, and thank you, Ben. This might be a good question to finish on, Ben. But like Claire, I'm for progress, but that's quite difficult today in a world where I guess the ideologies that supported ideas of progress seem to be discredited, and it feels like the discussions of progress are quite exhausted. So my question is, how do we reclaim progress for today? And is it possible to reclaim ideas of progress? And to do that, surely we need to have, surely to do that, we need the past, we need knowledge of the past. But you seemed a bit down on knowing the past and using that as a sort of guide to the future. But in education with young people, surely we need a positive, deep knowledge of the past to help them understand their place in the present and look towards the future.
Thanks very much, Alex. And we all hope, I'm sure, that the progressive power of electricity reaches your house sometime soon. But Ben, do you want to finish off? There's 3 questions there.
Yeah, no, good stuff. Alex's question, yeah, definitely. I think what would be useful in that way would really be, I guess you could say, a history of describing progress. Now, what I'm doing in the book is, you could say, it's a history and a present of describing progressivism. So I think a history of actual progress, of things getting better, would be really interesting alongside this book, but it would be a very different book. As for the other 2 questions, I was thinking of bringing them together, really, and I might muddy the waters again a little bit, complicate things if they can be complicated any further, is to distinguish between political belief and the sort of political alignment. A lot of progressives, they don't have this story of past, present, and future. They don't think about it all the time. They're not even aware of it. But as I put it, progressivism, it's a style of knowing. And it's a sort of a confidence you've got it all covered. At least maybe you may not understand, but your mates do. There are people in your sort of political group who get it. So if you're assured that it's all covered, that you're on the right side of history, you can just basically sort of go along through life feeling pretty confident and expressing opinions and not really thinking very much. And obviously that's what I'm against. So yeah, progressives, they don't have to believe in this story of past, present, and future. It's just the idea that or the assumption that it's taken care of. And I think this feeds into Nico's point about technology is, as I see it, and I mean, I haven't talked about technology. It's another aspect I haven't talked massively about in the book just because of space. But I would generally see it fitting into this sort of framework of the way we generally address technology now is to assume it's part of that thing that's covered, that we generally still trust in our institutions. We're getting rapid change with technology. A lot of it is genuine improvement, which is improving our lives, but there are obviously unintended consequences and negatives. So I'd say the danger there is again, it's always coming back to, you've got to just keep on looking at what's going on and thinking about it. And there's no substitute for that. And technology isn't a substitute for that. AI isn't a substitute for that. Over and out.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ben. If you all want to unmute, give him a round of applause. A little ripple would be good. Look, one of the last quotes I'll give of Ben's is where he says, many critics, if you think progressivism is bad enough, he then throws in ultra-progressive. So many critics see ultra-progressive turn in Western culture as an aberration against progress. And I think I'm probably one of those critics. I see it as an aberration against progress. Maybe it's because we're using the word progressive differently, but I think it means believing in progress, and it's pure and simple. Now, today, as some people have already pointed out, it means rejecting the whole conception of progress. I think in the conversation, that debate about agency versus fatalism is also quite an important thing to address. Knowing where we want to be is quite handy, I think. Knowing what we want the future to be is not a bad ambition. But then you have to convince people of the rightness of your views. Anyway, Ben's book's a great intervention in this conversation. It's obviously annoyed some people in the audience, which is always a good thing. But it makes you think. At the very least, it might help reclaim the word progress, or it might make us more adamant in having to think about a new word. So huge thanks to Ben. If you haven't got a copy of this book, Progress, the Progress Trap. If you don't have a copy, then please click on the link to Amazon in the chat. If you enjoyed the debate and you're a morally virtuous progressive person, then please think about giving us a donation. And please, if you haven't already got your ticket, get yourself along to the Battle of Ideas on the 18th and 19th, where Ben will also be appearing. So thank you all very much indeed. As I say, we would normally go down to the pub now, but unfortunately we're stuck in the ether. So that's progress. So thank you all.
Thanks, Austin. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you very much, Ben. Fantastic stuff, mate.
Thanks.